In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe finally began to exhale its last violent breath, a small town in the Hessen Valley lay broken beneath gray skies and endless drizzle. Its church bell cracked and silent like a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. The buildings stood hollow, windows shattered months before, their frames now covered with flour sacks that flapped weakly against the cold wind. Everything smelled of ash and wet limestone, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and won't let go. In the doorway of what used to be the town bakery, children huddled together wrapped in scraps of wool, their faces pale as candle wax, watching the empty street with eyes that had learned not to hope for much. The oldest, a 13-year-old boy named Hans Reinhardt, gripped a dented metal pot so tightly his knuckles had gone white, while his younger sister picked at the crumbling bricks, touching flecks of ash to her tongue because hunger makes you do strange things. The world around them had shrunk to a single terrible truth. Survival meant anything you could swallow, anything at all. Adults wandered the ruined streets like sleepwalkers, each carrying their own private terror, whispering about Russians moving west or Americans rolling in to burn what little remained as punishment for everything Germany had done. Mothers told their children to hide if they saw trucks painted olive green because the propaganda posters might be ashes now, but their lies still lived on in every frightened rumor. People truly believed the Allies would starve them for revenge, that starvation was the price of defeat. Then one cold morning, laced with wood smoke and the kind of rain that soaks you to the bone, a sound emerged from the mist that nobody expected. The low, steady rumble of engines, human and mechanical and somehow reassuring. From the fog came a column of jeeps and supply trucks, mud splattered across their khaki sides, white stars painted sharp as chalk marks on a blackboard. The soldiers wore helmets scuffed by months of travel, their eyes scanning the street lined with broken chimneys and collapsed walls, light catching the metal rivets on their fuel cans like brief flashes of fire. The villagers froze where they stood, mothers pressing children into door frames, and an old man tried to raise a white bedsheet atop a shovel handle, but his hands shook so badly he could barely hold it up. The convoy stopped in the town square and the engines clicked into stillness, no gunfire, no shouting. Only the sound of boots squelching through mud, and then a single truck backfired. One dry crack that made the entire crowd flinch as if lightning had struck right beside them. A medic jumped down from the truck bed and set a wooden crate on the ground with deliberate gentleness, painting an awkward grin across his exhausted face, pointing to the Red Cross symbol on his helmet as if to say, "We're here to help, not hurt." From inside that crate came what looked like miracles to people who had been starving for months. Metal cans of food, small canvas sacks of flour, rolls of clean white bandages, bars of chocolate wrapped in dull brown paper. The medic spoke slowly, testing out his broken German, saying the word Essen, which means food, and the pause that followed felt like the longest moment in history. Occupier facing occupied, enemy facing enemy. Nobody quite sure what would happen next. Then Hans, still gripping his battered pot, took one small step forward and the medic gestured permission, ladling thick soup from a field kettle directly into the boy's bowl, and the smell of beef and onion rose into the damp air like something from a dream. Hans's eyes flooded with tears before the taste even reached his tongue because sometimes relief hits harder than hunger ever did. All around the square, other soldiers began doing the same thing, setting up kettles that steamed in the cold air, spoons clinking against tin cups, and one corporal poured fresh milk from a canteen into cups for toddlers whose mothers stood frozen, too stunned to even move forward. Some of the women tried to kneel as if the Americans were lords or saviors, but the soldiers stopped them gently. lifting them back to their feet, and Hans's sister ate her first real meal in weeks and then began to sob. Not from fear this time, but from the shock of being fed by the people they'd been told were monsters. Her mother covered her face and cried without making a sound, and all around them the impossible unfolded like a play nobody had rehearsed. German civilians weeping over bowls of American military rations, their children licking fingers slick with stew. And in that single drizzling moment, defeat stopped looking like punishment and started looking absurdly like mercy. This relief convoy rolling through the Hessen Valley was just one of dozens sweeping across occupied Germany that spring. A strange mixture of military discipline and improvised compassion, because the formal surrender hadn't even been signed yet, but a different mission was already underway. The mission to feed people who until days ago had been the enemy. For most American soldiers, the front lines had ended a week earlier, but for the Germans, the war had never truly stopped. Every road clogged with refugees pulling carts made from baby carriages, widows walking barefoot beside horses too weak to carry loads, and the entire landscape resembled one giant exhaustion. Crops never planted because men were dead or missing, bakeries looted clean of grain, livestock slaughtered before they could even reproduce. People survived on weeds boiled into thin gray soup, and the children's bellies curved outward not from food but from hunger swelling against bone, that terrible distortion that signals starvation. Inside the U.S. Army, reports of mass starvation began filtering up through command channels, and General Eisenhower, who had already seen the concentration camps and understood what horror looked like, ordered immediate investigations into civilian conditions across the occupied zones. The 12th Army Group created emergency feeding stations, mobile kitchens mounted on the backs of trucks, barrels filled with reconstituted powdered milk, and soldiers who had been trained to kill were retrained overnight as relief workers and cooks. The same hands that had handled flamethrowers now handling soup ladles. Their orders were simple but unusual: assist without favoritism, observe without judgment, and it wasn't occupation yet in the traditional sense, it was survival triage on a continental scale. Some units found themselves in charge of entire towns within hours, drafting emergency ration lists on the backs of tactical maps, trading army gasoline for hidden bags of barley with farmers who had managed to hide a little food from the Nazi requisitions. The town near the old castle had once been small and self-sufficient, its daily rhythm set by the church bell and the hum of nearby industry. But by April 1945, its population had doubled, with families displaced by bombing raids. Every cellar packed with strangers sleeping on dirt floors. When the Americans first arrived, they found chaos and desperation, and the local mayor, a thin man whose wire spectacles had lost one lens, approached the occupying lieutenant with slow, deliberate politeness, fully expecting arrest or worse. Instead, the lieutenant asked him just one question: which houses have small children? And the mayor's answer, through a Pennsylvania-born interpreter of German descent, set everything in motion. What followed was a scene that shattered every rumor spread by Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda machine. American trucks backing into narrow alleys while soldiers unloaded rations that had originally been meant for their own troops. Field cooks assembling portable stoves outside the destroyed post office, humming fragments of swing tunes while peeling potatoes and passing around metal spoons to any woman who looked strong enough to help stir. They showed the German women how to mix powdered milk into water pulled from the town's old cistern, how to portion soup fairly so the youngest and weakest ate first. And nearby, a corporal named Harris walked between the wrecked houses distributing small rectangles of chocolate stamped with the words U.S. Army ration. Some of the children pulled back afraid. Their elders had filled their heads with stories about poisoned food from the occupiers. So Harris broke off a piece, placed it in his own mouth, and chewed theatrically like an actor on a stage. And only then did a small boy with dirt-smudged cheeks approach, take his piece, and bite down. His eyes went wide with surprise and joy, and then the others followed like cautious birds testing water after a long drought. The interaction spread and deepened, soldiers discovering that a few of the older Germans could still read English from lessons they'd taken before the war. So they taught new words over the rising steam of soup pots. Words like thank you and friend and tomorrow. Simple words that meant the world was not entirely broken. A military chaplain brought along a camera to document everything. The gaunt faces and hollow eyes determined that this moment would not vanish into cold statistics the way so much of war does. The soldiers' letters home that week turned unexpectedly reflective. One private writing, "Imagine it, our old enemies are just people trying to feed their babies." War feels different when you're handing the enemy's child a warm spoon. For the German civilians, every single sense had been inverted overnight. The thunder of tank engines that once signaled terror now meant the arrival of salvation, and the American flag they had been taught to fear as a symbol of vengeance had somehow become the herald of bread and safety. At night, the campfires that dotted the ruined town came from cooking rather than artillery explosions, and the smell of frying grease and onions, so mundane and yet so miraculous, drifted through streets that had been hollow for months still. Trust did not come easily or all at once because suspicion dies slowly. Some men held back, refusing to accept food from invaders. Mothers pushed their children forward first, as if testing the enemy's true motives through the innocence of the young. But hunger is its own negotiator, and within just a few days, orderly lines formed in front of each American supply truck. People holding out bowls quietly without speaking much, the queue stretching all the way past the ruined church foundation. The feeding operation continued for a full week, and with it came the slow, uncertain dawning among the townspeople that this was no temporary ruse, no propaganda stunt designed to humiliate them later, but genuine sustained relief. The Americans were not fattening them up for some cruel punishment. They were simply saving what could be saved of a generation that had been starved by war. In the uneasy calm that followed, the town began to feel something it had nearly forgotten during 6 brutal years of war. Not victory, not pride, nothing grand like that, just the steady rhythm of daily life made possible by the mercy of strangers who spoke a different language and wore a different uniform. By the 3rd morning of continuous feeding, the ritual had become almost ordinary in its regularity. American trucks rumbling up the hill just after dawn, their engines humming like a distant hymn, the white star insignia reflecting the pale early light, and villagers began gathering even before the sound of engines reached their ears. Women carrying pots that had been scrubbed clean of ash, children clutching salvaged tin cans, old men leaning on makeshift walking sticks fashioned from broken broom handles. Hunger no longer made them timid, now it made them tremble with cautious anticipation, because hope, once it takes root, is hard to kill. The soldiers had constructed an open-air field kitchen against the remains of the old schoolhouse using bent sheets of scrap metal as windbreaks, their portable stoves hissing like miniature factories, and the smells that rose from those pots, real meat and bitter coffee, drew every living creature within a half-mile radius. Those civilians strong enough to stand began helping without being asked, measuring out water from dented buckets, breaking apart wooden crates to use as kindling, stirring the thick powdered rations that transformed gray liquid into something resembling chili, and it wasn't traditional German cooking by any stretch, but it was warm and filling, and that alone made it miraculous. At first, a kind of formal distance remained between the two groups. Civilians kept to their orderly lines, and the American soldiers moved with cautious professionalism, but then small accidents began to crack that invisible barrier wide open. One morning, a boy of maybe 8 years old tried to sneak a second portion, not for himself, but for his baby sister, who was too weak to stand in line, and when a tall sergeant from Kansas caught him, the boy froze completely, expecting the kind of blow he might have received from the old German police. Instead, the sergeant knelt down to the boy's level, refilled the bowl without a word, and ruffled the kid's hair, saying softly, "For the little one," and the boy burst into tears so sudden and raw that others nearby began crying too. It was the first unguarded sound of collective grief the town had made since the surrender. By that same evening, the soldiers had learned most of the children's names. There was Hans and his sister, there was Greta and Wilhelm and little Anna, and one private began saving his daily chocolate rations specifically for them, hiding the bars in his tunic pocket like small treasures, while another soldier brought around a scruffy puppy he'd adopted from a ruined farmhouse, hoping it might make the traumatized infants remember what laughter sounded like. Slowly, incrementally, suspicion folded itself into something resembling gratitude, and news of the American generosity traveled between neighboring villages faster than the convoys themselves. Families arrived from miles away, trudging behind bicycles or pushing wheelbarrows with sleeping infants bundled on top of dirty blankets. They came, they said, to see with their own eyes the American soldiers who fed children before they fed themselves, and at a crossroads near the river some of the German women had begun tying white handkerchiefs to fence posts, a silent improvised code signaling to passing convoys that starving families waited just beyond. The men in those trucks answered those signs not with words but with immediate action, pulling over and setting up impromptu distribution points on the side of muddy roads. The American soldiers too were changing in ways they hadn't expected. Many of them had fought through the frozen hell of the Ardennes offensive. They had seen the horrors of Buchenwald and Dachau, images seared into their minds that no celebration could ever erase, and now feeding these desperate German civilians became for them a kind of penance, a way of asserting that humanity could still express itself even amidst total wreckage. They wrote letters to wives and sweethearts back home describing babies who ate donated soup like it was salvation itself, about the strange haunting quiet that fell over a crowd after every bowl had been scraped completely clean, and those letters carried a tone of bewilderment because war was supposed to create clarity about who was good and who was evil, but here in the mud everything had become complicated. Then came an incident that struck deeper than any of them anticipated. One afternoon, while the soldiers were unloading supplies near the town square, they discovered 3 German men rummaging inside an abandoned warehouse and expecting theft. The soldiers marched them out at gunpoint ready to enforce occupation law. But when they looked closely at what the men were carrying, it wasn't stolen property or hidden weapons. It was the carcasses of dead livestock they'd been trying to salvage for food because starvation still had not loosened its skeletal grip on the region. The lieutenant in charge, barely 24 years old, stared at those 3 exhausted men for a long time without speaking. And then he quietly ordered an immediate emergency distribution to every household in the area, double portions for any family with small children, no exceptions. That same night, the rain came down in heavy sheets. Supply trucks were delayed on washed-out roads, the field stoves sputtered and smoked, and the soldiers could have easily stayed dry inside their vehicles waiting for better weather. Instead, They built a makeshift roof from canvas tarps and kept the fires burning stubbornly beneath the downpour, and villagers emerged from their shelters to join them, shielding the flames with boards and soaked sleeves, and the whole scene looked less like conquerors and conquered and more like neighbors trapped together on the same desperate arc of survival. Later that same week, an exhausted medical corpsman discovered a hidden attic crammed with orphaned children from a nearby bombed-out town, their bodies so skeletal he could count every rib, and he called immediately to the other soldiers, who came running, and together they carried those fragile children through the mud to the American Field Hospital tent. The mothers from the main village followed at a cautious distance, expecting perhaps another tragedy in a year filled with tragedies, ours dragged by intense silence, and then finally a nurse appeared in the hospital doorway cradling one revived. Infant wrapped carefully in a U.S. Army blanket, her face lit with exhausted relief. A ripple of sound passed through the waiting crowd, gasps and sobs and knees buckling with gratitude. It was spontaneous chaos, but the kind born from joy rather than fear, and for the very first time the American soldiers no longer looked too. These people like occupation troops, they looked like the fragile bridge between life and death itself. By the time official reinforcements arrived weeks later with proper Red Cross supplies and formal relief infrastructure, this particular village had become a working model that was replicated across dozens of similar towns. The locals had reorganized their own distribution systems, learning from the Americans. The mayor, who had once been paralyzed with fear, now coordinated supply lists side by side with his occupiers, and children used pieces of broken chalk to draw crude five-pointed stars on ruined walls imitating the white insignia they saw on every passing truck. When the sun finally broke through the constant gray haze in late May, the town square filled with something resembling normal life again. Farmers brought small pitchers of fresh milk as gifts. An elderly woman approached with a hand-woven basket of eggs, saying carefully in slow English she hadn't spoken since before the war, "Our thanks to you." And the lieutenant, barely 23 years old with eyes hollowed out by fatigue, simply nodded and murmured, "Just keep feeding the kids, that's all that matters now." The war had taken nearly everything from both sides, cities and innocents and millions of lives, but that simple exchange, food offered freely across the propaganda divisions that had seemed so absolute, became their shared new measure of what victory could mean. By early summer of 1945, warm sunlight finally washed over the Hessen hills, bathing the scarred landscape in the soft green promise of recovery, and where tanks had once torn through the earth leaving deep gouges, fields began to hum again with the hopeful monotony of plows pulled by surviving horses. In the town the Americans had first fed, the makeshift kitchen built against the schoolhouse wall still produced smoke every morning, and children who had once flinched at the sight of any uniform now ran toward the soldiers in bare feet, laughter returning to their voices like a language slowly being relearned. The immediate famine crisis had eased, but its psychological consequences lingered deep. Hunger had marked the German psyche more profoundly than military defeat ever could. Crops would still take months to ripen fully. Orphanages remained desperately overcrowded, and black market traders circled like opportunistic flies over collective misery. Yet the strange partnership that had formed between these uniformed strangers and broken civilians somehow endured and evolved. Soldiers still arrived regularly with crates of condensed milk and canned meat, though now they accepted offerings in return, fresh eggs or hand-sewn patchwork quilts, and it was no longer pure charity. It had transformed into something closer to barter, something resembling the foundations of community. Within the rubble of the old church, American combat engineers erected a hand-pumped water station. its metallic rhythm filling the valley air, and mothers lined up with salvaged buckets each morning while soldiers teased the children and taught them to count in English. 1 to 3, that simple numerical cadence carrying through the hills more steadily than the church bell ever had. For the American soldiers, the mission had changed them in ways quieter and more permanent than they would openly admit. They had fought through minefields and watched friends die and had been told repeatedly that their enemy was inhuman and monstrous. Yet here in these ruined towns, they had learned that mercy could ache more sharply in the chest than hatred ever did. Sergeant Harris, the man with the hidden chocolate bars, wrote home one evening, "Feeding these kids feels more like winning than any battle I ever saw." And his words unknowingly echoed an unspoken sentiment spreading through the ranks. This recognition that real victory was not measured in territory captured or enemies killed, but in something moral and fragile, proved one bull at a time in forgotten places whose names would never make the history books. The villagers, meanwhile, began carefully patching their lives back together around the foundation of that experience. The mayor, once a frightened bureaucrat paralyzed by fear, reopened the town school using desks salvaged from collapsed buildings, and chalk dust replaced gunpowder in the air as the new defining smell. On the first day lessons resumed, an American private stopped by out of curiosity and found a room full of children reciting vocabulary from donated English primers, their shrill voices carefully pronouncing the words friend and bread and tomorrow. And he left that classroom with his eyes glittering, muttering something about hope being self-replicating if you just give it a chance. A photograph taken during that period captured the transformation more clearly than any written report could. It showed a line of still gaunt civilians sharing soup with two grinning American soldiers under a sun-bleached wooden sign that read Supply Post B, and the caption added later by a visiting war correspondent was elegantly simple: "Enemies eat together, peace begins here." Copies of that single photograph circulated quietly through Allied headquarters in the following weeks. Some officers glanced at it and scoffed dismissively. Others paused for a long, uncomfortable moment before turning away because it forced them to reconsider what they thought they knew about victory and defeat, even after the main American units rotated northward to new assignments. The townspeople kept the communal soup kitchen running using what little they had absorbed about organization and fairness. They maintained rations for the elderly and weakest first, recorded careful inventories on scraps of paper torn from old Nazi ration books, and the bitter irony was not lost on anyone. The very bureaucratic system designed for deprivation was now serving a kind of rough equality. One quiet evening, as the sun dropped behind what remained of the church spire, Hans Reinhardt found the section of wall where American soldiers had once painted their White Star insignia. He traced over it carefully with a stub of salvaged chalk, reaffirming the symbol before the next rain could wash it away. And his mother, watching from a doorway, said softly, "Remember always, they fed you when even we couldn't, when everything had fallen apart." Hans nodded slowly, uncertain exactly how to carry gratitude that enormous, how to hold in his child's heart the knowledge that enemies had become saviors. 20 years later, long after the towns had been rebuilt with modern efficiency and the uniforms had faded into museum displays behind glass, visitors to that particular valley still spoke in hushed tones about the spring of 1945, when foreign strangers had arrived not to punish but to nourish, not to conquer but to heal. For many people who lived through those weeks, the taste of American canned stew and reconstituted powdered milk was remembered with the reverence others reserved for religious rituals. Ordinary ingredients transformed into something sacramental through the alchemy of hunger and mercy combined. When mercy replaced the logic of conquest, the entire structure of war collapsed inward on itself. And the simple act of feeding, perhaps the most mundane human gesture imaginable, became a quiet revolution far more enduring than any gunfire or tactical victory. At the center of it all stood starving children holding battered spoons and exhausted soldiers who discovered through accident and necessity that compassion could mend fractures that military victory alone never could. When compassion crosses enemy lines, it fundamentally rewrites what the word victory even means, and when the strong make the deliberate choice to feed rather than destroy, war itself begins to starve.